Hey, my friends. So I'm coming at you guys today from a different place than I normally record. I'm in my bedroom. That's because I live in a house built in 1893 and there's no air conditioning in my office. So instead, you guys get to hang out with me in my bedroom. It's not creepy, I swear. So, book talk. It has been a huge topic of conversation for the last couple of years, and the biggest question is book talk actually helping in the publishing industry, or is it just screwing over really good authors? Let's talk about it. So I joined BookTok back in January of 2021. I was sick, I had COVID, and what else do you do when you're sick and you have COVID? You get on TikTok. I had never really been on TikTok before. I didn't totally understand what it was, and so I just started scrolling. And I found a creator that was doing videos about ACOTAR. Now, I didn't know what ACOTAR was, so I went on a kind of a video binge trying to figure out what ACOTAR was. Then I discovered what it was, and I read the first couple of books and kind of dived headfirst into BookTok at that point. Now, I didn't read all of the Sarah J. Maas books. I haven't read most of Sarah J. Maas's books, but I will say ACOTAR is what got me back into reading. I was a prolific reader when I was a kid. I read everything under the sun. I would get in trouble during school because I would hide my book behind my textbooks, pretending to be reading my textbooks, and I was actually reading my fiction book, and my teachers figured that out real fast. So I ended up going to college, and I think through going to college, for a lot of people, it kind of ruins your love for reading because you have to read so much for college that you decide to just stop reading in general because it's really frustrating. So I took a hiatus and I got back into reading in January of 2021 with ACOTAR, A Court of Thorns and Roses by Sarah J. Maas. Through the years, there's been a lot of discussion on whether or not BookTok is something that has helped the publishing industry or hurt the publishing industry. Everybody has different reasons for feeling the way that they do about it, either that it's been absolutely amazing or it's destroyed things. There was a huge slew of videos that came out after a magazine article talked about how BookTok had turned writing into fast fashion, essentially, where people would pump out books as fast as possible, not really caring whether or not the books were any good, just that they were hitting specific criteria that they knew would be successful on BookTok and make it go viral. Now, at first I felt like these videos and these articles that were being written were kind of, I don't know, they were kind of cringy to me. I felt like, why are we talking about this in terms of like, oh, it's really bad that people are reading, or it's really bad that people are producing and creating cool stories. But as I've progressed in my kind of diving into BookTok and then creating a YouTube channel to talk about it, I've started to kind of understand and agree with people that feel like BookTok has been more harmful than it has been helpful. But it has been helpful. So we're going to talk about that first. How has BookTok actually helped the publishing industry? For a lot of people, specifically women, they were a lot like me. They had taken a big hiatus from reading and they decided that they wanted to come back via watching videos on BookTok. They heard about this incredible book called A Court of Thorns and Roses, ACOTAR, and they really wanted to be a part of what all of the hype was. Sarah J. Maas was an entry point back into reading for a lot of people, and it's been absolutely incredible to see how many people are at the bookstores when only in 2010 they were talking about how bookstores were kind of falling apart, and Barnes & Noble was on the brink of bankruptcy. Thankfully, that is not the case anymore. Barnes & Noble is thriving, opening stores all over the country. It was recently purchased by Waterstone, and the CEO of Waterstone is now also the CEO of Barnes & Noble. They are doing some incredible things in the book space, including giving each store essentially its own free reign to decide how it wants to be organized, what books they want to purchase based on the demographic and what's selling in the area at that time. Now, Barnes & Noble didn't really do that before. I worked at a Barnes & Noble in Provo, Orem, Utah. I say Provo, Orem because it was the only bookstore in that area, and it served both Orem and Provo. It's also the most populated area for members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints because of Brigham Young University. And I was the chosen person to purchase books for the LDS section in that bookstore. I was the only person in the entire company that had that title. I was the LDS lead. And it's because of how crazy many members of the church lived in that area. It was a section of the bookstore that got a lot of traffic. But I was unusual. Barnes & Noble didn't normally do that. So now the independent booksellers that were doing those types of things, really catering to their audience, has influenced the large bookstores. And Barnes & Noble is now doing that, where each store has its own ability to do whatever they want with the organization, with the end caps, with the tables. So you're getting a lot of individualization with each of the stores. So how has BookTok influenced that? Well, if you've been into a Barnes & Noble or an Eborn Books, you will see a table, I guarantee you, that says BookTok, like hashtag BookTok or BookTok famous or as seen on BookTok. These are all books that would not exist if it was not for BookTok. There are so many books that I see on the shelves of Barnes & Noble that have been purchased specifically because BookTok, oh my gosh, that is really difficult to say after 50 times. Because BookTok has been so prolific in getting books out there to people. Now, there's definitely books that have been flashes in the pan that were there and then disappeared real quickly off of the virality of BookTok, but there's a lot of them that have had staying power, and publishers are paying attention. They are discovering the formula that it takes to make a book go viral and sell hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of copies worldwide. BookTok is almost like a thermometer gauge for the publishing industry of what's successful and what's not at the moment. So we've got the publishing sphere that is being able to essentially A/B test their market before they pick up books with BookTok, which is absolutely incredible because the more successful publications are, the more books they're going to be able to purchase from writers and get out there into the market. Here's the other side of that, though. And this is where I feel like BookTok has been harmful to the publishing industry. I was recently reading a book. It's called Serafina by Rachel Hawkins, and it was published in 2012. I had never heard of the book before. I went to a library book sale, and it was one of the remnants that they were selling off. So I purchased book 1 and 2, and they were really, really pretty covers. They felt really good in my hand. So I got it. And of course, it's about dragons. So, you have to at that point. And I was really struck as I started reading it, how beautiful the writing was. Most of the words had been very, very carefully selected in crafting this story and creating a depth that isn't there normally in a lot of the books that I read nowadays. There was a beauty and a poetry in the sentences that just drew me in and made me feel like I was being surrounded by a warm blanket and led very carefully into this story. It was obvious that Rachel had worked really, really hard on this book and worked really hard specifically on crafting a story that felt both comforting and beautiful at the same time as interesting and mysterious. Now, I'm not saying that books today are not like that. I just feel like BookTok has had an influence on what is produced that wasn't there before. The idea of a book going viral in 2012 did not exist. There were popular books. There were books that booksellers loved. There were books that were part of book clubs. There was the Oprah list. There was like the Reader's Digest books. There were specific lists that you could find out there. But books didn't go viral. That wasn't a thing that could happen. So you couldn't have a book at that time that came out and was beautiful and really, really good have overnight success. I'm not talking about Harry Potter and Twilight. That's a whole different video. But most books had to take some time to grow and become what they eventually became. Now, this book, I have no idea whether or not it became a New York Times bestseller. I have no idea if it made any lists, but what I do know is that sitting down and reading the prologue had me so enthused and so drawn in that I stopped reading basically everything else that I was reading, which included Reckless, which I am doing a whole video on. So for those of you that really enjoyed my Powerless rant review, you'll be getting a Reckless one soon too. But BookTok and social media has completely changed the game when it comes to publication. Where before being an indie publisher, being an indie published author was kind of looked down upon, well, not kind of, it was totally looked down upon. And the idea was like, well, you're not a good enough writer, so of course you're going to independently publish your book. Now, there are a lot of really great authors that are choosing to go indie because they know that the profit margins are going to be significantly higher and that they have a higher chance of making better money. But they have to do everything themselves. They have to do the editing, the cover, the marketing. I mean, granted, a lot of published authors have to be marketers themselves anyway, but that's a different point. Now, independently published novels can be out there as soon as the author is done with the story, which has created an incredibly low barrier to entry in the publication space. But with that lower barrier of entry has created a situation where I personally feel like books have become less about the writing and the art of writing and more about a checkbox and whether or not it's going to go viral. This includes in the publication space. Publishers more and more are picking up books because they check a bunch of boxes that the publisher knows are going to be viral. It's not about whether or not the book was any good. I'm looking at you, Gothicana. Or whether or not the story was very well crafted. I'm looking at you, Powerless. But it becomes more and more just about whether or not the book is going to go viral on BookTok and sell 100,000 copies, even though by the time everyone realizes the book isn't very good, the publisher is just going to be off onto the next viral book, and it won't matter whether or not the book was any good. The publishers now have this huge pool of authors who are willing to do an incredible amount of work to get their books out there, while at the same time not having access to all of the professionalism that a lot of these publications have. So the books that are being produced are not very good, but if there's a built-in audience, if the author has already done a ton of marketing, has worked really, really hard, and the book has sold, regardless of whether or not it's any good, the publishers can pick it up, change absolutely nothing, and then release it into the market to a wider range of people because they know it marks the boxes. You know what boxes I'm talking about. Is it have a trope that's very publication friendly, like enemies to lovers, or a morally ambiguous main character, or a shadow daddy like character? Is the female main character, specifically with romantasy, is the female main character very spunky and spicy, and does she, stand up to the man even if it's completely unrealistic and incredibly obnoxious? Does it check that box? Does it check the box of diversity and inclusion? Is the author a member of a marginalized class? Is the main character a member of a marginalized class? Well, if it is, then okay, we don't need to do any editing. We don't need to do any work on the book. We're just gonna ship it out. BookTok has created a situation where authors who didn't really have a chance before, either because their writing wasn't very good or because their stories were incredibly weak, now are able to publish their works to a vast majority of people and have it be successful, even if it isn't any good. And that's where I'm starting to see a really big difference. I've begun gravitating more toward books that were published in like the 2010s and 2015s. I've been gravitating more towards that time period because the books seemed to have been just better. I don't know how else to say it. I have DNF'd more independent books that I have found on BookTok that were pushed out there because they were supposedly so good and then just walked away real quick. Because if you can't capture me within the first 50 pages, I'm not going to continue reading it no matter what you say, unfortunately. What I would love to see is BookTok really begin to analyze and figure out what books are actually worth getting. There's a lot of books that are, suggested because they're super spicy or because they have an enemies to lovers trope, which, let's be totally honest, most enemy to lovers tropes are not true enemies to lovers. True enemies to lovers takes multiple books and the payoff is so rewarding. But most of the readers nowadays don't want to take the time to really get an in-depth story. When I was at a writers conference this last year, it was called Storymakers. There was a class that I got to take that was about writing to market. And I at first I didn't really understand what that meant, and which is why I was like taking the class to begin with, because I wanted to understand what she meant when she said, you need to learn how to write to market if you want to be really successful as an independent author. So I go to the class, and essentially she's teaching people to write books that fit the mold, that check all of the boxes that are going to make the book viral. And while I understand doing that, and if you're a really quick writer and you can write fairly well quickly, then do that. But I just want to advise maybe a word of caution. If you're going to write a story specifically because you know it's going to sell and there's nothing behind it other than it fits these boxes, I would suggest maybe take a step back and figure out some better way to do that. Because a lot of books that are coming out check the boxes, but they have no substance to them. They're what I call popcorn books. You enjoy it. It tastes really good in your mouth while you're sitting there. And then as soon as it's done, you have forgotten about the popcorn and you've moved on to something else. And as authors, we don't want our books to be like that. We want our books to be more like the, popcorn risotto that I had 8 years ago that I still think about because it was so good. We want our books to have impact on people, not just to check boxes. We want them to last and, put real meat on your bones as the reader. Now, I'm not saying, which it might sound like I am, but I'm not saying there isn't a place for popcorn books. There 100% is a place for popcorn books. You can't eat steak all the time. You can't have popcorn risotto all the time. So you have to have something light and fluffy to read in between. And I have 100% read those books and 100% enjoyed them and then moved on. And there's a place for those types of books. Normally, those types of books are called mid-list. Mid-list authors produce good books that people enjoy, but they're not the huge hitters that are going to, change the industry. So there is a place for those types of books. But if you're an author and you're really wanting to get your books out there, maybe think about mixing it up. Write the book that does well because the market's asking for it, but then work on the story that fills your heart. The story that makes you so excited that you can hardly wait to sit down to the keyboard. I really hope that today's conversation gave you something to think about. And please understand, I still love Book Talk. I think Book Talk is super fun, and I really enjoy watching the skits, the videos, the recommendations. But remember that you don't have to read a popcorn book if you don't like it. You also don't have to read a meaty book if you don't like it. You can read what you want to read, but I would caution the publishing industry, don't water down the quality just for quantity. If you found any value in today's video, please like and subscribe to this channel. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss a single video. And remember, you are worthy, you are loved, and happy reading.